The blade glinted under the moonlight, trembling in Jason Miller's hand. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale clouding in the cold air of St. Mary's Rectory garden. Father Andrew lay sprawled on the damp grass, his clerical collar stark against the crimson bloom spreading across his chest. The old priest's eyes were wide with shock, lips moving as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. Jason's heart thundered in his ears, drowning out the priest's shallow, desperate gasps. He stood there frozen, knife slick with blood, wondering if he had finally gone too far. Then, Father Andrew's hand twitched, and his gaze locked onto Jason's. A jolt of panic surged through Jason. Was he still alive? Could he call for help? Jason took a shaky step back, his mind racing. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the satisfaction, the closure, but now all he felt was a hollow ache. What had he done? The story began years earlier, back when Jason was just a shy, freckle-faced boy who never missed a Sunday Mass. His mother, a devout Catholic, had enrolled him as an altar boy the moment he turned 10. St. Mary's Church was their sanctuary, a place of refuge from the struggles of daily life. Jason admired Father Andrew, the man everyone in their small Ohio town regarded as a beacon of kindness and wisdom. Father Andrew had an aura of warmth that made people feel seen and valued. For Jason, who often felt invisible at school and overshadowed by his older siblings at home, the priest's attention was like a lifeline. When Father Andrew praised his dedication during Mass or clapped a hand on his shoulder, Jason felt a rare sense of pride. But as the months turned into years, the priest's attentions began to feel different. Jason couldn't put his finger on it at first. Father Andrew started requesting Jason's help with tasks outside of church services, cleaning the rectory, organizing donations. He would sit Jason down afterward, offering soda and cookies while they talked. The conversations began innocently enough, but slowly they veered into territory that made Jason's skin crawl. At 13, Jason tried to tell his mother. She had laughed nervously, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. "Father Andrew is a man of God," she said, her voice tinged with reproach. "He'd never do anything to hurt you." Jason stopped trying after that. The real breaking point came the summer Jason turned 16. One evening after choir practice, Father Andrew had cornered him in the sacristy. Jason had frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as the priest's hands gripped his shoulders. "You're special, Jason," Father Andrew whispered, his breath hot against the boy's ear. Jason had wrenched free and bolted, his body trembling with fear and revulsion. He never returned to St. Mary's after that night. But the memories lingered, festering like an open wound. As Jason grew older, anger replaced fear. He learned that Father Andrew's kindness had ensnared other boys too. The knowledge filled Jason with guilt. He should have spoken louder, fought harder. Instead, he'd allowed the man to continue his charade, hurting others in the process. That guilt turned to rage, and the rage festered until it became unbearable. Jason began to plan, each detail etched into his mind with precision. The knife, the secluded garden, the timing, all of it was meant to ensure that Father Andrew paid for his sins. Yet, standing there now, staring down at the broken man he had once admired, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost something too. A sudden noise jolted Jason from his thoughts, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Someone was coming. His stomach twisted as he looked down at the bloodied knife in his hand. There was no turning back now. Jason's body acted before his mind could catch up. He darted behind a row of tall hedges, crouching low as the footsteps grew louder. His breath hitched as he peeked through the leaves. A shadow moved across the garden, the figure's flashlight beam sweeping the ground. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. Was it a neighbor? A passerby? Or had someone inside the rectory seen him and called for help? The figure paused near Father Andrew's body, the beam of light illuminating the priest's blood-soaked cassock. Jason's stomach churned. He tightened his grip on the knife, its hilt slick with sweat and blood. He knew he should run, but his legs felt like lead. "Father Andrew?" a woman's voice called out, trembling with uncertainty. Jason's heart sank. He recognized the voice. It was Sister Margaret, one of the nuns who worked at St. Mary's. She took a hesitant step closer, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Father, are you okay?" Jason pressed a hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp. Sister Margaret's voice cracked as she dropped to her knees beside the priest. Her sobs cut through the silence, raw and heart-wrenching. Jason felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly swallowed by fear. If she saw him, if she recognized him. The crunch of gravel behind Sister Margaret made her freeze. Jason's breath caught as another figure appeared. A man this time, tall and broad-shouldered. It was Officer Daniels, the town's police chief. Jason's mind raced. How had the police arrived so quickly? "Sister Margaret," Daniels said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Step back. Let me see." The nun stumbled to her feet, her hands trembling. "He is gone," Daniels said grimly. He stood, his eyes scanning the garden. "Stay here. I will call for backup." Jason's muscles coiled as the officer's gaze swept dangerously close to his hiding spot. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew the sound would draw attention. He gripped the knife tighter, his mind a whirlwind of panic and regret. As Daniels turned toward the rectory, Jason made his move. He crept along the hedge line, keeping low, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound of Sister Margaret's sobs and Daniel's radio chatter filled the air, masking his quiet footsteps. He reached the edge of the garden, his pulse spiking as he spotted the darkened alley beyond. Freedom was just a few steps away. But as he stepped onto the gravel path, a sharp beam of light caught him square in the face. "Hey, stop right there!" Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. Jason's stomach dropped as the officer reached for his holster. Without thinking, Jason turned and bolted into the alley, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand. The world around Jason became a blur of shadows and noise as he sprinted down the narrow alley. His lungs burned and his legs screamed for rest, but fear drove him forward. Behind him, he could hear Daniel shouting into his radio, the static-laced words sending a chill down Jason's spine. Suspect fleeing on foot, armed, need backup. Jason rounded a corner, his sneakers skidding on the damp pavement. The knife felt like a lead weight in his hand. He knew he should ditch it, but something inside him wouldn't let go. It was more than a weapon now. It was a symbol of everything that had brought him to this moment. He burst out of the alley and onto a quiet residential street. The houses loomed on either side, their windows dark, their occupants oblivious to the chaos unfolding outside. Jason's eyes darted around, searching for a place to hide. His gaze landed on a parked car with its driver's side window cracked open. Desperation overrode caution as he sprinted toward it. Jason yanked the door open and slid into the driver's seat. The keys were still in the ignition. A stroke of luck, or maybe fate. His hands shook as he turned the key, the engine roaring to life. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart leaping as he saw Daniel's figure emerge from the alley, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "Stop!" Daniel shouted, raising his gun. Jason didn't wait. He slammed the gear shift into drive and hit the gas. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, the force pressing him back against the seat. He sped down the street, the houses and streetlights whipping past in a dizzying blur. Behind him, Daniel's shouts faded into the distance, replaced by the wail of approaching sirens. Jason gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. His mind raced. Where could he go? What could he do? He had no plan, no destination, only the overwhelming need to escape. As the sirens grew louder, Jason's eyes flicked to the gas gauge. The needle hovered just above empty. A fresh wave of panic surged through him. He couldn't outrun the police forever. He needed to think, and fast. Then, in the distance, he spotted it. an old, abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. Its broken windows and crumbling facade loomed like a beacon in the darkness. Jason's heart pounded as he veered off the main road, the car bouncing over potholes and gravel as he made his way toward the derelict building. He killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. The warehouse loomed ahead, its shadowy interior promising both refuge and danger. Jason tightened his grip on the knife and stepped out of the car. He had nowhere else to go. As he approached the building, the sound of sirens faded, replaced by the eerie stillness of the night. Jason pushed open the rusted door, its hinges groaning in protest. Darkness enveloped him as he stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He had escaped for now, but he knew the hunt was far from over. Inside, the warehouse smelled of mildew and rust. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting eerie patterns on the floor. Jason moved cautiously, his eyes darting around for a hiding spot. In the corner, he spotted a stack of old crates, their shadows deep and impenetrable. He crouched behind them, clutching the knife to his chest like a talisman. Minutes felt like hours as he waited, his ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The distant wail of sirens grew fainter, but Jason knew better than to let his guard down. He replayed the night's events in his mind, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. What had he become? Suddenly, a faint creak echoed through the warehouse. Jason's breath caught, his grip on the knife tightening. Someone was inside. He pressed himself against the crate, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound of footsteps grew louder, deliberate, and unhurried. Whoever it was, they weren't in a rush. They knew he was there. Jason swallowed hard, his mind racing. Should he run? Confront them? The footsteps stopped, and a voice called out, low and steady, "Jason, we need to talk." Jason's blood ran cold. It was Daniel's. The officer's voice echoed through the cavernous space, calm but commanding. "I know you're scared," Daniels continued, "but running isn't going to help you. Let's figure this out together before it gets worse." Jason's breathing quickened. His sanctuary had turned into a trap. He peered around the edge of the crates, spotting Daniel's shadow moving closer, flashlight sweeping the ground. His pulse roared in his ears as adrenaline surged through his veins. He had to decide, hide, fight, or flee. Before Jason could act, the faint sound of tires on gravel reached his ears. His stomach dropped. More officers. Red and blue lights flashed through the broken windows, painting the walls with streaks of urgency. The cavalry had arrived. Daniels cursed under his breath, glancing toward the source of the lights. "Jason, listen to me," he called out, his voice edged with urgency. "You've got one chance here. Come out now, and I'll do my best to help you. But if they come in..." His words trailed off, leaving the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Jason's hands shook as he weighed his options. The knife felt heavier than ever, the blood drying on its blade a stark reminder of what he'd done. Every exit seemed blocked, every choice a dead end. Despair clawed at him, but so did something else, a flicker of defiance. He tightened his grip on the knife, his jaw set. If this was the end, he wasn't going down without a fight. Suddenly, the warehouse door creaked open, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Jason's muscles coiled as the footsteps of multiple officers filled the space, their voices sharp and authoritative. Daniel's calm demeanor shifted, a note of urgency creeping into his tone. "Hold on," Daniels barked. "Let me handle this." But the officers didn't stop. Flashlights cut through the darkness like searchlights, the beams slicing dangerously close to Jason's hiding spot. He held his breath, his knuckles white as he clutched the knife. A flashlight beam landed on the crates, illuminating Jason's trembling figure. "There!" a voice shouted, and the sound of weapons being drawn filled the air. Jason's heart thundered as he realized the moment of reckoning had arrived. "Drop the knife!" a voice thundered, echoing through the cavernous warehouse. The light from several flashlights converged on Jason, making him feel like an animal cornered in a trap. His breathing was ragged, his knuckles white as he gripped the blade. Daniels stepped into view, his hands raised, palms outward. "Jason, listen to me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want this to end badly. Let's talk. Just put the knife down." Jason's eyes darted around the room, his mind racing. Every exit was blocked. Officers fanned out, their weapons trained on him. The pressure was suffocating, but so was the memory of Father Andrew lying lifeless in the garden. The man who had taken so much from him was finally gone, but the cost of that justice was closing in fast. "No!" Jason shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. He deserved it." His hands trembled, the knife glinting in the harsh light. Daniels took a cautious step forward, his gaze locked on Jason. "I believe you," he said, his voice softening. "But this isn't the way. Whatever he did to you, we can make it right. Killing him, it won't take the pain away." Jason shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "You don't get it," he choked out. "He ruined my life. He ruined other kids' lives. Nobody stopped him. Nobody cared." Daniels hesitated, the weight of Jason's words pressing down on him. He had heard whispers over the years, quiet accusations that had never made it to an official report. The church influence in their small town had a way of silencing things, sweeping them under the rug. Looking at the broken young man in front of him, Daniels realized those whispers had been more than just rumors. "You're right," Daniels said, his voice steady. "What he did was wrong. Evil, even. But if you hurt someone else tonight, you'll lose everything, Jason. Don't let him take any more from you." Jason's grip on the knife felt arid. The rage that had driven him this far clashed with a deep, crushing exhaustion. He had spent so long consumed by hatred, by the need to make Father Andrew pay. Now, with the priest dead and the police surrounding him, all he felt was empty. "Jason," Daniels urged, taking another step closer. "It's over. Let me help you." The tension in the room was palpable. Every officer's finger hovered near their trigger, the air thick with the possibility of violence. Jason's chest heaved as he looked at the faces staring back at him, some hard with judgment, others tinged with pity. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Slowly, he lowered the knife, letting it clatter to the ground. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and for a moment, everything was still. Daniels moved quickly, signaling the other officers to lower their weapons. He stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. "Good choice, Jason," he said quietly. "Let's get this sorted out." But just as he reached for Jason's arm, the warehouse door slammed open with a deafening crash. Everyone turned, their weapons snapping toward the noise. Jason's eyes widened as a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a dark suit, flanked by two others. "I am Father Thomas," the man announced, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm here on behalf of the diocese. This young man is coming with me." Daniels frowned, his hand hovering near his holster. "With all due respect, Father, this is a police matter now." Father Thomas smiled thinly, his gaze cool. "With all due respect, Officer Daniels, the church has its own way of handling these situations. You've done your job. We'll take it from here." Jason's blood ran cold. The church. Even now, they were trying to protect their own. His muscles tensed as the officers exchanged uncertain glances. Daniels stepped closer to Father Thomas, his expression hardening. "This boy just confessed to murder," Daniels said firmly. "He's not going anywhere but the station." Father Thomas's smile didn't waver. "Are you sure about that, officer?" he asked, his tone dripping with implication. "The church has been very generous to this town. I would hate for that to change." Jason's fists clenched as rage bubbled to the surface again. They were trying to bury him, just like they had buried everything else. His eyes darted to the knife on the floor, the flicker of a desperate plan forming in his mind. And then, before anyone could react, Jason moved. Jason lunged for the knife, his movements fueled by a surge of desperation. The officers shouted, a chaotic chorus of warnings and commands. Daniels reached out, trying to grab Jason's arm, but he was too quick. The blade felt cold and familiar in Jason's hand as he turned, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Stay back," he shouted, the knife trembling as he pointed it toward the men. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding like a war drum. The room froze, the tension palpable. Daniels raised his hands slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Jason, put it down. You don't want to make this worse." But Jason wasn't looking at Daniels. His gaze was locked on Father Thomas, who stood unfazed, his hands clasped in front of him. The man's calm demeanor only stoked the fire in Jason's chest. "You think you can take me?" Jason spat, his voice shaking. "You think you can make this all go away? Not this time." Father Thomas's expression darkened, the faintest flicker of annoyance breaking through his composed facade. "Jason, you're making a mistake," he said coolly. "Put the knife down, and we can talk about this." Jason let out a bitter laugh. "Talk? Like you talked to the other kids? Like you talked to the families who begged for justice? No, I'm done talking." The officers shifted uneasily, their weapons still trained on Jason. Daniels took a cautious step forward. "Jason," he said gently, "whatever you're thinking, don't do it. Let me help you. Let's end this the right way." Jason's grip on the knife tightened, his mind racing. He felt cornered, like a wild animal with no way out. His rage boiled over, and he took a step toward Father Thomas. "You're just as bad as he was," Jason snarled, his voice raw with emotion. "You let him hurt us. You let him get away with it." Father Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his tone turning icy. "Put the knife down, or you'll regret it." Jason hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. But the thought of surrendering, of letting the church sweep everything under the rug again, was unbearable. And then, the sound of distant sirens broke through the tense silence. Reinforcements were coming. Jason's window of opportunity was closing fast. His mind made up, Jason took a deep breath and moved. With a burst of speed, he lunged toward Father Thomas, the knife flashing in the dim light. The officers shouted in alarm, their movements a blur as they closed in. Jason felt a jolt of resistance as the blade struck, followed by a searing pain in his side as something slammed into him. He staggered, the world tilting as chaos erupted around him. He hit the ground hard, the knife skittering out of his hand. Pain radiated through his body as he struggled to breathe. Above him, the officers wrestled Father Thomas to the floor, their voices a cacophony of commands and shouts. Blood pooled beneath Jason, warm and sticky, and his vision began to blur. Daniel's face appeared above him, his expression a mix of anger and concern. "Stay with me, Jason," he said urgently, pressing his hands against the wound in Jason's side. "Help is on the way." Jason tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. The room spun, and the sounds around him grew distant, like they were coming from underwater. As darkness closed in, his last thought was a flicker of triumph. For the first time in years, he had fought back, and then everything went black. Jason awoke to the steady beeping of a heart monitor. His eyelids felt like lead, and his entire body ached. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils as he blinked against the harsh fluorescent light. It took a moment for him to register where he was, a hospital room. Memories of the night flooded back, crashing over him like a tidal wave. The knife, the blood, the chaos. His hand instinctively moved to his side, but he winced as a sharp pain stopped him. Bandages wrapped tightly around his torso were a grim reminder of how close he'd come to death. "Good, you're awake." Jason turned his head to see Officer Daniels sitting in a chair by the window, his arms crossed. The man's face was unreadable, a mixture of weariness and guarded relief. Jason's stomach churned. He had no idea how much Daniels knew or what was going to happen next. "You've been out for 2 days," Daniels continued, his voice steady. "Doctors said you'd pull through, but it was touch and go for a while." Jason didn't respond. His throat was dry, and his mind raced with questions. Why was Daniels here? Why wasn't he in handcuffs? And what about Father Thomas? As if reading his thoughts, Daniels leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're lucky to be alive, Jason," he said. "Lucky I was there to stop it from getting worse." Jason's jaw tightened. "You call this lucky?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. Daniels sighed, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. You assaulted a priest and resisted arrest. There's a mountain of evidence against you, not to mention witnesses." Jason scoffed, anger flaring in his chest despite the pain. "A priest? Is that what you're calling him? He's just like Father Andrew. They protect each other. They always have." Daniel's expression hardened. "I know what Father Andrew did to you. I know about the other boys. But this isn't the way, Jason. Killing him won't erase what happened." Jason's hands curled into fists, the memory of Father Thomas' cold gaze searing into his mind. "You don't understand," he muttered. "None of you do." Daniel stood, his gaze piercing. "Then help me understand. Tell me everything." Jason hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. He half expected a nurse or another officer to burst in, but the hallway beyond was quiet. He swallowed hard, the weight of years of silence pressing down on him. If he didn't speak now, he might never get another chance. "I was 13, Jason began, his voice trembling. He told Daniels everything, the grooming, the manipulation, the way Father Andrew had stolen his innocence and shattered his trust. He described the guilt that had consumed him as he learned about the other victims and how the church had done nothing to stop it. By the time he finished, tears streamed down his face and his chest heaved with the effort of holding back sobs. Daniels didn't speak for a long time, his face a mask of controlled anger. "I believe you," Daniels said finally, his voice low. "But the law doesn't work on revenge, Jason. If we want justice, we have to do it the right way." Jason laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Justice? There's no justice for people like me. They'll just move him to another church, just like they did with Father Andrew." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Not this time. Not if you help me. We can take him down, Jason, but I need you to trust me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promises. Jason stared at Daniels, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and hope. Could he trust him? Could he risk it all again, knowing the system had failed him before? Before he could answer, the door swung open and a nurse entered, her expression polite but firm. "I am sorry, officer, but Mr. Miller needs to rest now." Daniels nodded, rising to his feet. "Think about what I said," he old Jason, his tone resolute. "I will be back." As the door closed behind Daniels, Jason sank back into the pillows, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But the question remained. Could he trust anyone to help him win it? The hospital room felt like a cage. Jason stared at the ceiling, his mind churning with unanswered questions and mounting dread. Officer Daniels' words echoed in his ears. "We can take him down. Trust me. Trust." It was a foreign concept now, tattered and frayed by years of betrayal. Yet as much as he wanted to dismiss Daniels, something about the man's quiet determination lingered. Could he really help? Or was this just another trappa system feigning compassion only to let him fall again? Jason's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He tensed, his body instinctively curling inward as it swung open. To his relief, it wasn't Daniels or anyone official. A nurse entered, her kind face framed by soft brown curls. "You've got a visitor?" she said, her voice gentle but cautious. "Do you feel up to it?" Jason frowned. A visitor? His mother had passed years ago, and he couldn't imagine anyone else showing up now. "Who is it?" he asked, his throat still raw. The nurse hesitated. "It's a young woman. She says her name is Emily." Jason's heart skipped. Emily Jacobs. The name pulled him back to a time he'd tried so hard to forget, a classmate from high school, one of the few people who had ever shown him genuine kindness. They had drifted apart after graduation, but her smile, warm and unguarded, was etched into his memory. "Let her in," he said, after a pause. The nurse nodded, stepping aside to reveal Emily. She was thinner than he remembered, her once bright eyes clouded with worry. But when she saw him, her face lit up with something resembling relief. "Jason," she breathed, stepping into the room. "I heard what happened. I needed to see you." He studied her, his chest tightening. "Why?" Emily moved closer, pulling the chair Daniels had vacated earlier to sit by his bedside. "Because I know what Father Andrew did to you," she said softly. Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "And to others. I knew something wasn't right back then, but I didn't know how to help. I should have done more." Jason's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He didn't know what to say. For so long, he'd carried his pain alone, convinced no one else cared or even noticed. Hearing her acknowledge it now felt both comforting and raw. "I didn't expect anyone to believe me," he said finally, his voice low. "Not then, and not now." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I believe you, Jason, and I want to help." "Help?" Jason repeated, a bitter laugh escaping him. "It's too late for that. Everything's already a mess." Emily shook her head. "It's not too late. Daniels is right, you can still fight this. You don't have to carry it alone." Jason looked away, his gaze fixed on the window. The sky outside was gray, heavy with the threat of rain. "What's the point?" he muttered. "The church covers for people like Father Andrew. It always has." Emily reached out, her hand resting gently on his. "Then we make sure they can't cover for him anymore." Her words were bold, but Jason couldn't ignore the fear lurking beneath them. She was taking a risk by coming here, by aligning herself with someone society would happily label as a criminal. Yet, there was something in her eyes, a quiet defiance, that made him pause. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "Because I've seen what happens when people like him get away with it," she admitted. "Not just to you, but to others. I can't stand by and do nothing anymore." Jason stared at her, the weight of her words settling over him. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope stirred in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Before he could respond, the door opened again. This time, it was Daniels. His expression was grim, but his eyes softened when they landed on Emily. "I see you've had company," he said, nodding at her. "Good. You'll need all the support you can get." Jason tensed. "What's going on?" Daniels stepped closer, his tone firm. "We've got enough to start building a case, but we need more, and that means we need your help." Jason frowned. "What kind of help?" Daniels glanced at Emily, then back at Jason. "We need you to testify. Against Father Andrew. Against Father Thomas. Against everyone who's been part of this cover-up." Jason's stomach churned. Testify? The thought of standing in court, bearing his soul in front of strangers, made his skin crawl. But before he could voice his doubts, Daniels leaned in. "I won't lie to you, Jason," he said. "It's going to be hard. They'll try to discredit you, to paint you as the villain. But if you're willing to stand up and tell the truth, we can take them down." Emily squeezed Jason's hand, her eyes pleading. "You can do this, Jason. You're stronger than they think." The room fell silent, the weight of their words pressing down on Jason like a physical force. His heart raced as he considered the choice before him. He could stay silent, let the system fail him again, or he could fight, knowing the risks, but also knowing it might finally bring some measure of justice. Jason took a shaky breath, his gaze locking with Daniels. "Okay," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I will do it." The courtroom was suffocating. Jason sat at the plaintiff's table, his palms damp with sweat. The walls seemed to close in around him, every whisper and rustle of paper a sharp reminder of where he was. The prosecutor, a steely-eyed woman named Linda Chase, sat beside him, her presence both reassuring and intimidating. Across the room, the defense table loomed like a fortress, where Father Andrew sat flanked by his legal team. His calm demeanor and faint smile made Jason's stomach churn. Emily sat in the gallery, her eyes never leaving him. Her presence was a lifeline, tethering him to the fragile sense of courage he'd managed to muster. Daniels was there too, standing near the back, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Jason felt their support, but it did little to quell the storm raging inside him. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver hair, entered and took her seat. As everyone settled, Linda leaned in toward Jason. "Remember," she said softly, "speak your truth. No matter what they throw at you, stay calm. You've got this." Jason nodded, though his heart was pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. The prosecutor rose to make her opening statement, her voice steady and firm as she outlined the allegations against Father Andrew. She painted a picture of a trusted figure who had abused his position, weaving a narrative that was both damning and deeply personal. Jason's stomach clenched as Linda described the events leading up to his attack on Father Andrew. Hearing it laid out so clinically made him feel exposed, as though every eye in the room was dissecting his pain. When she finished and sat down, she gave him a small nod of encouragement. The defense attorney, a polished man in a tailored suit, rose with a smirk that set Jason's nerves on edge. He began his statement. When Linda finished, Jason felt like he'd run a marathon. But it wasn't over. The defense attorney rose, his sharp eyes narrowing as he approached the stand. "Mr. Miller," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you claim these events occurred years ago. Why didn't you report them to the authorities at the time?" Jason bristled but forced himself to stay calm. "I tried to tell my mom," he said. "She didn't believe me. And I was scared. I thought no one else would believe me either." The attorney nodded, feigning understanding. "Scared," he repeated. "Yet you weren't too scared to attack Father Andrew with a knife. Can you explain that?" Jason's jaw tightened. "I was angry," he admitted. "Angry at what he did to me and to others." The attorney's smile was thin and predatory. "Others? Do you have evidence of these alleged others, or is this just another baseless accusation?" Jason hesitated. He had no names, no proof beyond his own experiences. The attorney seized on his silence, turning to the jury with a smug expression. "No further questions," he said, returning to his seat. Jason's heart sank as he stepped down from the stand. He felt exposed and vulnerable, as though the attorney had stripped away every ounce of his credibility. But when he returned to his seat, Linda gave him a reassuring look. "You did great," she whispered. "Don't let him get to you." As the day's proceedings wound down, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge adjourned for the evening, and Jason left the courthouse feeling drained. Emily and Daniels were waiting for him outside. "You were brave in there," Emily said, her voice filled with conviction. "No matter what happens, you did the right thing." Jason nodded, though his doubts still gnawed at him. The battle was far from over, and he wasn't sure how much fight he had left in him. But as he walked away with Emily and Daniels by his side, a small part of him dared to hope that the truth would finally come to light. The courtroom was packed on the final day of the trial. The air was heavy with anticipation, the whispers and murmurs hushed as the judge entered and called the proceedings to order. Jason sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. This was it, the day his truth would either be believed or dismissed. Emily sat in the gallery, her steady gaze never wavering. Daniels stood near the back, his expression as firm and unreadable as ever. The defense had rested its case the previous day, leaving the jury to deliberate. Linda Chase had delivered a closing argument that left Jason in awe. She had painted a vivid picture of the fear and manipulation he had endured, the courage it took to speak out, and the damning reality of a predator cloaked in the guise of holiness. Jason could still hear her words echoing in his mind. This case isn't just about Jason Miller. It's about justice for every voice that has been silenced by fear, doubt, and power. Now, all they could do was wait. The judge turned to the jury foreperson. "Have you reached a verdict?" she asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, rising to stand. Jason's heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The foreperson handed the slip of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The judge unfolded the paper, her expression neutral as she read the words. Jason's hands tightened around the edge of the table, his breath held as he awaited her announcement. In the matter of People vs. Andrew Colton, on the charge of sexual abuse, the jury finds the defendant. The judge paused, her voice steady. Guilty. The room erupted into gasps and whispers. Jason felt as though the air had been punched from his lungs. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind, a lifeline pulling him out of the darkness he had lived in for so long. He turned to Emily, who was already on her feet, tears streaming down her face. She gave him a small, trembling smile, her eyes filled with pride and relief. The judge raised her gavel, silencing the room. "Order. Order in the court." She turned her attention to Father Andrew. "The defendant will remain in custody pending sentencing." Jason dared to glance at Father Andrew, who sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. His legal team whispered furiously, but the priest didn't react. For the first time, Jason saw him not as the towering figure who had haunted his nightmares, but as a mana-flawed, broken man finally facing the consequences of his actions. As the court adjourned, Jason stood on shaky legs. Emily was at his side in an instant, pulling him into a tight hug. "You did it," she whispered. "You finally did it." Jason nodded, though his mind was still reeling. He caught sight of Daniels, who gave him a curt nod before slipping out of the courtroom. Jason wondered if he would ever see the officer again, but he felt a deep gratitude for the role Daniels had played in his journey. Outside the courthouse, the world felt brighter, the air lighter. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing and their questions flying. Jason shielded his eyes, overwhelmed by the chaos. Emily grabbed his hand, guiding him through the throng of people toward a waiting car. As they drove away, Jason stared out the window, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, and a faint but growing sense of hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. "You're free now," Emily said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "Free to move forward, free to heal." Jason turned to her, a small, tentative smile forming on his lips. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess I am." The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars of his past would take time to heal. But for the first time, Jason felt ready to take that first step toward a new beginning. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. The truth had finally won. This concludes the story of a former altar boy who murdered a priest for molesting him several years ago. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions about this shocking story in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to get notified whenever there's a new video. It will help us bring you more impactful content. See you in the next video.